Mr. Palmesano.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Speaker. Will the sponsor yield for some questions?
Ms. Nolan, will you yield?
Yes.
Sponsor yields.
Thank you, Ms. Nolan. I have a series of questions for you. I kind of want to walk through some issues here if we could. The first question I have for you, do you know what the #1 industry in our state is?
Yes.
And what is that?
I think it's agriculture.
Agriculture.
Don't you?
Yep, we're off to a good start. So,
Thank you for starting with an easy one.
So, recently, because this bill has obviously gotten a lot of attention, have you spoken to any farmers recently about your bill, the impact it's going to have on them? Have you sat down with a number of farmers to talk to them?
I've had the great privilege, Mr. Speaker, I've had the great privilege of meeting on many occasions with the representatives of the Farm Bureau of our state. They have a competent and professional staff that represents them with great vigor and ardor, just as energetically as my colleague who spoke prior did. And it's been my great pleasure to have met with them many, many, many times over the many, many years that we have fought for collective bargaining rights for farm workers. Yes, indeed I have.
And during those meetings, did they explain to you the struggles that they're facing, relative to costs, other issues? They've laid that out to you, the challenges they're facing?
Yes, Mr. Speaker, and that is one reason why we have compromised significantly in this bill and put in place a 60-hour trigger for the overtime, which, again, would not have been my preference. We carried and passed a bill with a 40-hour trigger on 3 separate occasions. But on this occasion, in deference and understanding the work of this important industry, yes, the #1 industry in our state, we have put in effect a 60-hour trigger.
There's a lot of talk about farms. I think there's a misconception, especially from people not from an agriculture area, when they think of farms. They think of big corporate operations, corporate farms. But do you know what percentage of farms in New York State are family-owned farms?
Many of the farms in our state, perhaps predominantly, are small family farms, but I would remind the gentleman, I think he did participate, and I want to thank the chair of the Labor Committee, Mr. Crespo, as well as I mentioned Ms. Lopardo, in a roundtable that the Assembly had where we heard from a farm laborer, a farm worker, whose job was to set up the mechanical equipment for 2,500 cows 3 times a day. Now, I don't know about you, Mr. Speaker, and my colleagues, but 2,500 cows is not the image that most people have when they say family farm. That's a lot of cows. And as I understand it, the farm that he works for had many more cows. And he was expected, as other workers were, to set up the equipment. So again, I'm well aware of what is happening in this critical industry, and I've spent a great deal of time listening to my colleagues who have talked about its importance. And one of the things I've learned is that through mechanization and technology, this is a highly sophisticated business. And the image of just a humble person milking a cow on the family farm, while perhaps true in the 1930s when the farm laborers were excluded from the Fair Labor Standards Act, is not true in 2019. 2,500 cows milked 3 times a day by one farm laborer through the technology and the mechanization of the farm. So much so that when the gentleman cut his hand, he could not stop setting up the equipment because there was no time to take care of that injury.
Thank you, Ms. Nolan, because I know the question was, do you know what percentage of family-owned farms? It's 98%. And I guess that's fine if you want to go on and keep talking.
I would just say to the gentleman, the 98% figure, yes, but the image of the family farm is not necessarily 2 or 3 people eking out a living on the homestead on some television show. It is a successful, large business that we want to support. And we have supported with tax breaks and incentives and business things that we have done over the years. And yes, it is something we want to support by bringing them into the 21st century to employ their workers.
Ladies and gentlemen.
I can appreciate your comments, Ms. Nolan, but I have some more questions, and I think what you've already guaranteed is I'm going to be using my second 15 minutes. If you keep talking, just don't answer the question. But I have more questions.
Yes.
So, how many hearings did the Assembly hold on this issue? Public hearings. I can answer it. 0. How many did the Senate have? 3. In what parts of the state? Don't you think an issue as big as this, that's as impactful, I know you believe this is a big issue, as impactful as this is to farm workers deserve to have hearings? Don't you think it's an insult to our farmers, the #1 industry in our state, that they didn't get to have their voice heard on this issue. And I'm not talking with individual meetings and stuff like that. I'm talking about just having public hearings where they could travel, that someone had to travel hours away to the Senate hearings. There were no hearings in the Finger Lakes, there were no hearings in the Southern Tier, none in Western New York, none in the North Country. Isn't that kind of an insult to our farmers that we couldn't hold a hearing in those areas to hear from them?
No.
All right. Well, listen, every member of our conference sent a letter to the Speaker, to the respective Agriculture and Labor Chair on this, pleading for hearings, asking to give a voice to our farmers. Let them come and talk to you. Let them explain what's going on, the struggles they're facing. And the Assembly could not bother to have one hearing, even one hearing. So what I believe you've done, if you told farmers that they're not valued, it's an insult, their voice doesn't matter. So I have some other questions for you. Farm Credit East did a study a couple years ago, right around the time of the minimum wage. Do you know what farm labor costs as a percentage of net farm income in the United States was?
Labor costs are a very high driver of costs on farms, yes.
Yes, so in the United States it was 36%, but in New York State it was 63%. So doesn't that right there tell you right there, our farmers in New York State are already at a competitive disadvantage when they're compared to their neighboring states, the surrounding states, Pennsylvania, Ohio, other farm states? Isn't that, we're already at a competitive disadvantage?
It doesn't tell me that.
No? That's surprising. I think most people would think so. Do you know how many?
Well,
I
I could give a longer answer, but then the gentleman will tell me I'm talking too much, and so I don't want to do that. But no, I don't agree with his.
All right, that's fine. Do you know how many dairy farms we've lost in New York State in the past 5 years?
I'm well aware that in my 35 career history here, we have lost dairy farms all of those years. And guess what, colleagues? Never once have the farm laborers been responsible for that because we don't have collective bargaining rights for them. So when I got here, we had 15,000 dairy farms. Now we have less than 8. That's not because the farm laborers are getting a day of rest. That's not because the farm laborers are getting overtime. That's not because the farm laborers are getting time and a half. That's not because they have a union. If dairy farms are closing, it's because people have moved from a small model of a handful of animals to big farms, yes indeed, family owned, but big farms with 5,000 cows, not little farms with 100 cows. Well, and I would also remind the gentleman that fluid milk production in our state has gone up pretty much every year that I've been here, because through the technology and the innovations and the hard work and dedication of our farmers, farms are producing more milk. Even with fewer numbers of actual farms, the amount of milk produced and the call that the federal government puts for the milk has increased in our state pretty much every year I've been here.
I know on the original bill there was an estimate done that if this bill, obviously the original bill would have increased farm labor costs by $300 million and decreased net farm income by 25%. I know with the modifications, that's probably narrow, but still an impact nonetheless. But do you know what net farm income has dropped over the past few years by 50%? Did you know net farm income has dropped by 50% over the past several years? So I know you're saying about farms closing, so it's not because they're making a lot of money. And I noticed you mentioned that they're producing a lot more milk, but are you aware that our farmers have little or no control over the prices they receive and they produce, unlike other manufacturers who can increase the price of a product, or a restaurant, when you increase the wages, you can increase the price of a meal. Farmers have no discretion to increase prices. They're just dealt the price and have to deal with it.
It's my understanding, Mr. Speaker, that this is a multi-billion-dollar industry and that the innovation, that collective bargaining, the treating of the workers a rising tide lifts all boats. And as we have seen with minimum wage legislation, paying people an adequate wage helps contribute to the economy of the communities that they are in.
I want to get to the issue. I know there's a provision in this legislation that says there's a no strike provision, but there's a lawsuit that's pending. Does this legislation supersede that lawsuit so that if there's appeals that where they could strike and during the harvest season? I know this legislation does it. Does this supersede that? Does that overrule that if something were to change?
Not that I'm aware of.
Okay,
the
fine.
courts can do what they wish, and they do. But obviously, they take into consideration what we do here as a separate but equal branch of government. And I'm sure that the consideration that we have shown in this bill to try to strike a balance I know a balance that some do not see, but that I certainly think we have struck a balance, because we have gone from a 40-hour overtime trigger in the original bill to a 60-hour overtime trigger in this bill. I believe that that balance will be read by the courts as an attempt to be fair to all sides, and may indeed change the outcome of any legislation that any lawsuits that would continue. But I certainly don't know and can't speak to it, not being I'm not an attorney either. And it's amazing, right, the careers that we bring here, but we do things on behalf of people. I'm a woman, and yet men here talk about women all the time. I don't say I have to be able to talk about men. You know, we all have different capacities that we bring here. That's the genius of American democracy. So I think I am, as best I can in my own modest way, trying to be as educated as I can and bring this bill to the floor.
Thank you. I know there's now, with this legislation, paid family leave would be an eligible benefit for the farm workers. Is there any clarification on when that paid family leave can be taken? Can it be taken in the middle of a harvest time? Is that whenever it's needed, whenever it comes up? Are there any guidelines or restrictions on when it can be used?
Not that we're aware of, no.
Okay.
No.
I know my colleague might talk back about this again, about the definition of a family member, you know, and I hope he does, is when you talk about like a relative, it's not a brother or a spouse. We're talking about nephews and cousins, how family farms. I hope my colleague brings that back up again when he comes back up. I think that's an issue. I wish they would have looked to modify that a little bit, because there are instances where a son and a nephew, the nephew works on the farm, but now he's going to be held outside that wage, outside of the family definition, and then ultimately he would be possibly owner in a farm, but this could cause problems with that by the language you have in this bill, the narrow scope of family.
Yes, we believe, Mr. Speaker, that the Commissioner of the Department of Labor can address this issue and expand to include, you know, second cousins 3 times removed if the Commissioner of Labor feels it needs to do that. So there is a wide definition of what is a family, and we certainly support that and understand that. I think the bill talked about siblings. I'm going to look at it in a minute, but I have no particular objection to the Commissioner of the Department of Labor expanding the circle of family members who would not be eligible for various benefits under this bill.
I want to get to the wage board issue again. Was there any rationale or reason why the Ag and Markets does not have an appointment or is not part of that wage board, and it's just the Department of Labor, given this we're impacting the agriculture industry?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, for my colleague asking this critically important question that I'm happy to answer. All wage boards, except for this one, are just the Commissioner of Labor, but again, in deference and in understanding the unique needs of the farm industry and in support of our farm owners and in support of our farmers who put so much of their lives, as our colleague so eloquently said, into their business, the Labor Commissioner must consult with the Ag and Markets Commissioner at the wage board. So that actually is language that applies to no other industry. We don't ask the Commissioner of Labor to talk to the Transportation Commissioner if it's a transportation wage board. We don't ask the Labor Commissioner to talk to the DEC Commissioner if it's a group on the water. Only in this one industry have we carved out an additional step that the Labor Commissioner must consult with the Ag and Markets Commissioner. So I felt, again, in the spirit of compromise, something that wasn't in the original bill, I felt it was important to do that. And to make that concession, if you will call it that.
Thank you for that clarification. Regarding the wage board itself and how they can take up possible changes in the future, I know that right now we have a 60-hour as part of the bill, but now the wage board can convene and they can, at some point, I think it's December by 2020, they can make a recommendation if they want to lower that amount from 60 hours to 50 hours to 40 hours. If they so choose, would that automatically be implemented, or does it have to come back to the legislature to ratify? Whatever that wage board decides, that's what happens. So if they decide arbitrarily to make it 40 hours within a year, they can do that?
Well, again, Mr. Speaker, my colleagues, there is a language in the bill that would require, if a wage board was to act in that manner, which I find hard to believe because the Farm Bureau would be part of the wage board, as well as the AFL-CIO, which is a responsible group in our state with a long history of working through these types of labor agreements and labor issues. The AFL-CIO is not a radical organization. It is a responsible organization that has existed in our country for a very long time, that occupies a seat on these wage boards and is well aware that a job is better than no job. So presumably, responsible people will come up with achievable goals. But if in the event that they run wild and they do something that, very dramatic, the Commissioner of Labor has the ability to not listen to the wage board. Again, I think all wage boards have that, but I think we've put some additional language that the commissioner could modify it, they could confer, they could reconvene. So again, we've tried in every way that we could to empower the farm owners so that they would understand that we care. We don't want to put this important industry in any way in a negative position. We just want justice for the worker end of the balance scale.
Mr. Palmesano?
Yes, thank you, Mr. Speaker. Thank you, Ms. Nolan. And as Arnold Schwarzenegger said, I'll be back. Thank you, Ms. Nolan. It's just really, I don't know if it's so much a question, just something to clarify. I think I know the answer. I just wasn't sure. I didn't get a chance to ask when we were talking before. As you're aware, a lot of farmers pay for housing and transportation costs for immigrant workers who come in. Now, with this collective bargaining, is that something that is going to be able to be taken into account when they're talking about wages and benefits, or is that something totally separate? I just wasn't sure of the answer to that.
It's separate, and I want to point out, and I appreciate so much the gentleman's question, that the section regarding housing will not go into effect till January of 2021, which will give our farm employer community time with our state budget, hopefully to do more support for them. And also want to remind the body that, remember, they also charge when housing and other things are provided because of the distances and things like that. They do charge the employees a rate for the housing and what have you. So it's like many things here, it's sort of a two-way street in this very unique industry, and we're trying to thread the needle to keep the industry good, but also help the workers.
Thank you, Ms. Nolan. I know it's been a long day. I appreciate your time. Mr. Speaker, on the bill.
On the bill, sir.
Mr. Speaker, my colleagues, listen, I know some of you have taken the time to sit down and meet with our farmers and an agricultural community. I know when you did that, it was sincere and genuine. I appreciate that. I know our farmers appreciate that. And I know some of you, some friends, have come up to visit, have been on farms in my district, have been to a dairy farm, have been to a vineyard, have been to a potato farm, took the time to listen and talk to our farmers in my region. I know how much our farmers appreciated that. I just want you guys to know how much I appreciate that. It was very sincere, and that's a great thing. And I know some of you conducted some roundtables. But Mr. Speaker, my colleagues, as a legislative body, by not holding public hearings around the state in every agricultural region of this state, not even just one public hearing. And people saying it wasn't necessary, I think you sent a very clear and, quite frankly, damaging message to our farmers and our agriculture industry that their input wasn't needed or valued. It did not need to be heard. And unfortunately, Mr. Speaker, my colleagues, this bill we have before us is, quite frankly, going to destroy the family farm in New York State. Make no mistake about it. That's exactly what this bill is going to end up doing. It's going to destroy the family farm in New York State. I know some have said that there's a negotiation, there was a compromise with the Farm Bureau on all this. I have a different take on that. Yes, I know there are some provisions in the bill making it 60 hours, but that wage board can change that within a year. There's other things that can change anytime. And I didn't view this as a negotiation or a compromise. I viewed it a little differently. It was a choice. Basically, it was either a gun to the head or cut off the arm. A gun to the head, that's a quick death. But if you cut off the arm, you're still going to bleed out and you're still going to die. That's what's going to happen to the family farm in New York State. That's what I'm concerned about. That's what a number of my colleagues are concerned about. And you can say, well, how can I make that claim? Well, let me go through some of the statistics again. I didn't make these numbers up. These are factual numbers. First, 98% of the farms in New York State are family-owned farms. Yes, I know some say it's a billion-dollar industry. Yes, but that doesn't mean our farmers are doing well. They're not, and I'm going to give you some numbers to back it up. There was a study done by Farm Credit East in 2016, prior to the minimum wage passage. That study showed that farm labor costs as a percentage of net farm income in New York State, or in the country, was 36%. 36% in the country. But farm labor costs as a percentage of net farm income in New York State was 63%. So what does that tell you? That already tells me that the farmers in New York State are already at a severe competitive disadvantage to our farmers in other states. We've lost 20% of our dairy farms in New York State over the past 5 years. 20% of our dairy farms are gone. The original bill, I know it's not the original bill, the study showed that would increase farm labor costs by $300 million, or 20%, and decrease net farm income by 25%. So maybe it's not that much, but there's still, we can't deny, there's going to be a significant increase in farm labor costs and a significant decrease in net farm income. And this is on top of, ladies and gentlemen, my colleagues, net farm income in New York State over the past several years has already declined by 50%. And let me remind you, this has come up over and over. Our farmers have little or no control over the prices they receive for the products they produce. Unlike other businesses like manufacturers who make a product, they can increase the price when the costs rise up. Our farmers cannot do that. It's impossible. I know some have said, well, I'll pay more for a gallon of milk. That doesn't happen. It doesn't work that way. Our farmers are struggling. My colleagues, my friends, I know many of you want for your families and your constituents your milk, your vegetables, your fruit at a good price as soon as you get it, when you want it. But let me tell you, that just does not happen. There's a tremendous investment in cost to a farm. I know when you, again, I'll repeat that when you hear billions of dollars, you think, well, the farmer's rich, he's making a big profit. No, he's not, or he or she is not. The farmer's not making a big profit. Again, I already talked to you about how net farm income is declined 50% over the past several years and will decline under this bill. Our farmers are cash poor. Yes, they have land. You're going to say, well, they have all this land, they're wealthy. Yeah, they might have land, but ladies and gentlemen, they're not land rich. They have mortgages and double mortgages and second mortgages and triple mortgages. They are financed to the top that they can do. Put on top of it the highest property taxes they pay, some hundreds of thousands of dollars in property taxes. Equipment, a tractor or equipment to run a farm costs $250,000 to $500,000 or more. This is just not something they can write a check for. They have to finance it. They can't finance anymore. They are suffering. Even feed costs are their biggest costs. I remember when we visited a farm with my colleagues who came up, we were talking to the dairy farmer, and we talked about their property taxes, we talked about the equipment, and I know you remember, they said their biggest costs were their feed costs. This is a challenge. Again, my colleagues, they cannot increase the price that they receive for the product they receive. They can't do it. We can't just pay more for a gallon of milk. It doesn't happen that way. It's not like any other business. Do you know how heavily regulated the agriculture industry and family and farms are? Federal, state, and local. What they're facing? They're just trying to stay afloat, my colleagues. They're just trying to preserve their heritage, their generational farm, their family farm. But you know what? Maybe, just maybe, you would have heard that message if you had public hearings around the state, like the farmers asked, like our conference asked of you. Why not have hearings around the state? This bill is too big, too important, something like that deserved to be viewed. At least the Senate had 3 hearings. Why couldn't the Assembly hold 1 hearing or several hearings? It sends the wrong message. It sends the very wrong message. You chose not to do it. You didn't think we needed to do it. That's unfortunate. That's very sad. You must thought you knew what's best instead of listening to the farmer. And let me add, some of our biggest advocates for our immigrant farm labor is our farmer. They try to help. I know when years ago I used to work for a congressman and trying to get immigrant farmers, labor to come over, having problems, trying to help. The farmers were the ones there advocating, trying to provide help, providing housing, providing transportation. These are things they want to do. They want to help the farmer, the farm worker. So my colleagues, as I conclude my comments on this debate, as a result of this bill, as more and more of our family farms continue to close and are not going to be able to pass on their family farm to the next generation of family member, let me remind you, and I hope you remember, one simple fact. If there are no farms, there is no food. If there are no farms, there are no farm workers. Mr. Speaker, I'm going to be voting in negative. This is a disappointing day, and I urge my colleagues to do the same. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.